In October of 1943, a warship stood silently in the harbor of Philadelphia. The air around it shimmered, just faintly at first, like heat rising from asphalt. Then, before the eyes of men who would never speak the same again, the ship began to blur. Its edges softened, the steel rippled, and in a flash of blinding blue light, it vanished, gone. Not beneath the waves, not over the horizon, simply erased from sight, as if reality had blinked. They say it was a test, a government experiment in invisibility. But if that's true, the question isn't how it disappeared. It's where it went, and perhaps more terrifying, what came back. The Navy called it nonsense, a rumor, a misunderstanding between radar cloaking and optical illusion. But for decades, whispers have lingered in classified halls and sailors' bars, stories of men fused into metal, of shadows seen where no light should fall, and of orders sealed under threat of silence. What if the US Navy didn't just hide a ship from the enemy, but from time itself? This is the story of the Philadelphia experiment, the ship that disappeared. A mystery suspended between physics and fear, between history and hallucination. Some say it's nothing but a hoax. Others claim to have been there when the ocean swallowed a vessel whole. And before this story is over, you might start to wonder, not whether it happened, but whether something like it could happen again. World War II was not only fought with guns and ships, it was fought with secrets. Beneath the roar of engines and the echo of bombs, another battle raged quietly, the war of invention. Every nation was desperate to outthink the other, to discover a weapon or a technology that could tip the scales. For the United States Navy, that pursuit turned toward invisibility. Not the kind found in comic books, but the kind whispered in laboratories and military briefings, where men in white coats promised miracles they barely understood. In 1943, radar had become both a shield and a curse. The Allies depended on it to track German U-boats, yet the same technology exposed their own fleets to detection. The Navy dreamed of a vessel that could slip unseen through enemy eyes. To the public, the word was camouflage. To those with clearance, it was something else entirely, electromagnetic invisibility. The USS Eldridge was born in secrecy, a newly commissioned destroyer escort built in Newark, New Jersey, and assigned to the Atlantic Fleet. On paper, it was nothing unusual. But sailors stationed nearby began noticing odd deliveries, massive generators, thick copper coils, and teams of scientists who didn't wear uniforms. They spoke in equations and moved like they were guarding the edge of a revelation. The documents describe a degaussing operation, a harmless process meant to protect ships from magnetic mines. Yet, some say what happened at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard went far beyond magnetism. Witnesses recalled the air around the ship growing charged, compasses spinning wildly, and a humming that made teeth ache. To them, this wasn't mine protection. It was an attempt to bend light itself. Official Navy statements would later insist nothing out of the ordinary occurred. But war is a convenient place to bury truth. During those years, hundreds of classified experiments vanished into the black holes of bureaucracy, their results known only to a few men who answered to no one. And in that shadow, the idea of the Philadelphia experiment took root, not as a legend, but as a possibility. The whispers began with sailors on neighboring ships. They spoke of electrical storms that appeared from clear skies, of strange lights forming over the Eldridge like an aurora trapped in a bottle. Others claimed they'd seen the ship blink, fade, or ripple, just for a moment, and then reappear in the same spot, as if reality itself had hiccuped. Most dismissed these stories as the hallucinations of exhausted men. But the war had taught people one thing: impossible was just another word for classified. At the same time, science was racing ahead faster than ethics could follow. Albert Einstein had already proposed his unified field theory, an attempt to explain gravity, electromagnetism, and the fabric of space-time as one grand equation. His work inspired fringe theorists who believed it could be weaponized, that electromagnetic manipulation could distort perception, even matter itself. Some of these thinkers found quiet contracts within the Navy's Office of Research. Their papers disappeared from academic journals and reappeared stamped confidential. Years later, Historians would find hints of these efforts, references to Project Rainbow, a supposed Navy initiative exploring radar invisibility and light refraction through magnetic oscillation. But no official file has ever been found. What survives are fragments. A few intercepted memos, a handful of declassified naval tests, and stories told by men who claimed they were warned never to speak again. The line between truth and rumor blurs easily in wartime. Governments build myths to hide operations, and conspiracies bloom in the gaps. Yet sometimes, myths survive precisely because they contain a kernel of truth, something small enough to be denied but large enough to be remembered. When the war ended, the USS Eldridge went on to serve quietly, transferred to the Greek Navy, and eventually retired decades later. But by then, its reputation had outgrown its hull. To conspiracy theorists, it was no longer just a ship. It was a symbol of what humanity might have touched when it tried to command the unseen. History records the Philadelphia experiment as a story, without evidence. But every story begins somewhere, and this one began with fear. The fear of losing a war, and the arrogance of believing science could rewrite the laws of nature. And then, on October 28th, the ship disappeared. The morning of October 28, 1943, began like any other at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. The air carried the brine of the Delaware River and the smell of hot steel. Welders shouted over the clang of hammers. Seagulls hovered above, circling the docked destroyers. Among them stood the USS Eldridge, its crew restless, waiting for another round of equipment tests. Most of them didn't understand what they were part of. Orders were vague, sealed under classifications that promised both danger and glory. Inside the ship, coils of thick copper wire wrapped around the hull like veins pulsing with potential. Giant generators thrummed below deck, their rhythm steady and deep, like a second heartbeat. Scientists from the Office of Naval Research moved between stations, murmuring calculations. The crew joked to hide their unease. Some said they were making the ship invisible to radar. Others whispered of something stranger, bending light, bending reality. At 9 a.m., the order came through. Power up. The hum became a roar. The metal floor vibrated underfoot. A few men reported the taste of copper on their tongues, as if the air itself were charged. The water surrounding the ship began to ripple outward, not from wind or tide, but as if drawn by an invisible current. On the dock, sailors shielded their eyes. A faint green mist began to form around the Eldridge's outline. At first, a shimmer, then a pulsing glow. Witnesses later described it differently. Some said the ship was swallowed by fog. Others claimed it phased out, turning transparent, flickering like a mirage in the heat. A few swore they saw it completely vanish, leaving behind only an empty wake where a 240-ton vessel had been moments before. For several long seconds, silence ruled the harbor. Then came the sound, an electric shriek, like the sky tearing. Light erupted from nowhere, bending shadows backward. Tools fell from trembling hands as sailors stumbled away, shouting. One witness claimed he saw the shape of the Eldridge fold in on itself, shrinking to a point before vanishing into thin air. And then, nothing. No waves. No echo. Just the low crackle of electricity fading into the wind. The officers on duty stood frozen. Some insisted it was an illusion, an optical trick, a malfunction. Others stared at the empty dock with wide, wet eyes, whispering prayers. Within minutes, word spread across the base. The ship's gone. Minutes stretched into hours. Radios picked up nothing. The coordinates were silent. Some claimed radar blips appeared hundreds of miles away near Norfolk, Virginia, only to vanish just as suddenly. Others believed the ship had slipped into another dimension, a theory born not from imagination, but from panic. Then, just as inexplicably, it reappeared. Witnesses said it materialized with a flash, the green mist collapsing inward. The air felt heavy, pressed down by something unnatural. The Eldridge was back, but it was not the same. Smoke curled from vents. Metal glowed faintly as if scorched by lightning, and the men on board were screaming. When rescue teams boarded, they found chaos frozen in place. Some sailors were missing entirely. Others staggered about, disoriented, their eyes unfocused, as if they were still seeing somewhere else. And then there were the ones who didn't move at all. Men fused into the bulkheads, their limbs merging seamlessly with steel. One man's hand was embedded up to the wrist in a deck plate, the skin and metal indistinguishable. The survivors spoke of sensations that defied reason. They said their bodies vibrated uncontrollably, as if their ATMs had been rearranged. Some claimed they floated outside their own forms, watching themselves scream from a distance. One sailor reportedly vanished during a medical examination, dissolving into thin air before horrified doctors. Medical officers filed brief, sterile reports. But unofficially, words like Feislock and field distortion appeared in margins. The story began leaking through whispers, carried from sailor to sailor, then to nearby bars, and finally to the public, where it grew like wildfire. The Navy denied everything. They called it exaggeration, a misunderstanding of a simple radar cloaking test. Yet, behind locked doors, investigations quietly continued. Some officers were reassigned without explanation. Others disappeared from the record entirely. Families of missing crewmen received contradictory letters, some claiming their loved ones had transferred, others that they died in service. None were given details. The Eldridge returned to duty shortly after, its hull repainted, its crew replaced. But among sailors, it became known as the ghost ship of Philadelphia. Those who served near it afterward reported strange occurrences, tools vanishing, static voices over intercoms, footsteps echoing in empty corridors. Some swore they saw shadows of men walking through walls. Was it all mass hysteria? The power of rumor amplified by wartime stress? Or did the Navy truly stumble into something it couldn't control, something that blurred the line between science and nightmare? Years later, when details of the so-called Project Rainbow surfaced, skeptics dismissed it as conspiracy. But every conspiracy begins with a moment that defies explanation, and this was that moment. The day the USS Eldridge vanished, witnesses were left staring into the empty waters, confronted by a silence that felt alive. Whatever happened that morning at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard was more than a trick of the eye. Whether by experiment, accident, or something beyond our comprehension, the boundaries of reality seemed, for a brief instant, to bend. But the real mystery wasn't what vanished. It was what came back. When the USS Eldridge vanished from Philadelphia, there were no answers, only silence, static, and the uneasy sense that something enormous had gone wrong. But within minutes, hundreds of miles south near Norfolk, Virginia, dock workers noticed something impossible. A faint shimmer over the water. A flicker of light where no vessel had been a moment before. And then, suddenly, violently, the Eldridge was there. It didn't glide into port or emerge from fog. It snapped into existence, as if reality itself had misfired. Witnesses would later describe it as appearing out of thin air, surrounded by a green haze that crackled and burned against the ocean spray. The air smelled of sulfur and ozone, and those who stood too close swore their skin tingled with static. One man claimed the horizon itself bent around the ship, like a mirage trapped inside glass. At first, there was hope that whatever had gone wrong in Philadelphia had somehow resolved itself. But as the rescue boats approached, that hope curdled. The men aboard the Eldridge were not celebrating. They were screaming. Some were missing entirely. Others wandered the deck in dazed circles, their eyes hollow and unfocused, mumbling words that didn't make sense. A few seemed unable to stand, trembling as though gravity itself had changed beneath them. And then came the discoveries no one could explain, the bodies that defied logic. Several sailors appeared fused to the metal of the ship. One man's torso protruded from a bulkhead, his face twisted mid-breath, eyes wide but unseeing. Another was embedded up to the knees in the deck, flesh and steel melted together seamlessly. No blood, no burn marks, just an impossible union of human and machine. The rescuers tried to pry them free, but the metal didn't yield. It was as though both had been poured into the same mold. Even the survivors weren't whole. Some flickered in and out of visibility, their outlines softening at the edges like heat distortions. Others claimed they couldn't feel solid ground beneath their feet, as though their bodies were half here, half elsewhere. They spoke of moments when their hands passed through solid objects, when walls seemed to breathe, when the air felt thick, alive, almost sentient. Later accounts, buried in whispers and unofficial memos, described this phenomenon as phase shifting. The theory went that the ship, and everything aboard it, had been pulled out of sync with our dimension, passing through a place not meant for human eyes. A thin veil between worlds, torn open by magnetic fields and human arrogance. For a brief moment, the Eldridge had become untethered, existing in two realities at once. The men who survived weren't just injured, they were changed. Physically intact, but psychologically fractured. Some refused to speak, staring blankly for days before being transferred to naval hospitals under false names. Others ranted about the green light, the humming void, or the feeling of God watching. One sailor was said to have vanished in front of a nurse, right in the middle of a sentence, never to return. Officially, none of this happened. The Navy claimed the ship had been conducting routine tests and that no abnormalities were recorded. Yet the crew's service records were sealed, and their families received letters laced with contradictions, some declaring honorable discharges, others quietly listing non-operational casualties. The few who dared to talk were quickly silenced or labeled unstable. But fragments of testimony slipped through the cracks. A dock worker in Norfolk told reporters years later that he'd seen the ship's outline flicker, like it didn't belong here. Another claimed he'd watched a man fall through a solid railing and vanish into thin air. The stories were dismissed as drunken fantasy until too many of them began to sound the same. And then, almost as suddenly as it appeared, the Eldridge was gone again. It reappeared hours later back in Philadelphia, to the horror of those who'd seen it vanish. Whatever journey it had taken, through distance, time, or something beyond both, had marked it forever. For months afterward, strange electromagnetic disturbances were reported near the shipyard. Radios crackled with voices that didn't exist. Compass needles spun at random. And at night, sailors swore they saw faint glows rising from the Eldridge's hull, as though it still remembered where it had been. Those who studied the aftermath suggested that the experiment had caused a dimensional bleed, a merging of realities, brief but catastrophic. Some scientists even claimed that the field generated by the ship might have warped time itself, bending space into a loop that momentarily erased its presence from our world. But if that's true, then where was it during those missing minutes? What did the crew see? No one could say for certain. The only thing clear was that something had happened, something beyond physics, beyond control. A glimpse of a truth that wasn't meant to be seen. The Navy moved quickly to bury the event under layers of denial and red tape. The Eldridge was quietly reassigned, its logs edited, and its crew scattered. But rumors spread faster than orders, carried by frightened men who had looked into the abyss and come back wrong. And as the story faded into legend, one question lingered, haunting, unanswerable, and quietly terrifying. If the Navy did it once, did they ever stop? By the time the USS Eldridge was decommissioned, its story should have faded into the background of wartime rumor. But it didn't. It lingered, quietly, persistently, like a half-remembered dream that refused to let go. And years later, one man would bring that dream screaming back into public consciousness. His name was Carl Meredith Allen. Though most people would come to know him by the name he signed at the bottom of his letters, Carlos Allende. In 1955, a respected astronomer named Morris K. Jessup received a strange package at his office. It was a copy of his own book, The Case for the UFO, returned to him through the mail. The pages were covered in notes, scrawled in 3 distinct handwritings, each color-coded, each seemingly written by a different person. The margins were filled with cryptic commentary, references to magnetic fields of the universe, free energy drives, and experiments that open the fabric of time. The tone was conspiratorial, yet oddly informed, like someone who knew just enough to be dangerous. The name on the package was Carlos Miguel Allende. Jessup read with growing unease. The letters spoke of the Philadelphia experiment, a secret Navy project that made a ship invisible and transported it through space. Allen claimed to have witnessed it firsthand from the deck of a nearby merchant vessel, the SS Andrew Furseth. He described seeing the Eldridge shimmer, fade, and vanish completely. When it reappeared, he said, men were screaming, fused into metal, or gone entirely. His language was feverish, but specific. He cited dates, ship names, coordinates, details that shouldn't have existed if the story were fiction. Yet it was written with such manic energy that it felt unstable, teetering between revelation and delusion. Jessup, a man of science, wanted to dismiss it. But something in Allen's words unsettled him. There was an undercurrent of obsession, yes, but also of knowledge. Whoever Allen was, he seemed to understand electromagnetic theory beyond the reach of ordinary rumor. And that was what made it dangerous. Over the following months, Allen continued to write dozens of letters, each more erratic than the last. He hinted at technologies beyond Einstein, spoke of fields overlapping fields, and accused the Navy of tampering with the invisible. Jessup tried to engage him rationally, asking for documentation, names, or verification. But Allen's replies became even more cryptic, filled with symbols and talk of the Watchers, a mysterious group monitoring those who knew too much. Then, something stranger happened. Jessup was contacted by the Office of Naval Research. They had received a copy of the case for the UFO annotated in the exact same handwriting. The book, the Navy said, had been mailed anonymously to them. Someone inside the military wanted to know more. The Navy arranged a private meeting with Jessup, during which they questioned him about the letters and the alleged experiment. He was shown a bound version of his own book, the same edition, only labeled Vero Edition. It contained every one of Allen's notes, typed and cross-referenced by naval intelligence. The implication was clear. Someone inside the government was taking the story seriously. Jessup was rattled. He began lecturing about the event publicly, blending skepticism with growing fear. But the more he spoke, the more his life began to unravel. Publishers distanced themselves. Colleagues called him paranoid. His wife left him, and Allen, the man who'd started it all, vanished into obscurity. Years passed before anyone heard from him again. When reporters eventually tracked him down in the 1960s, he was living under aliases, working odd jobs, and rambling about time travel and government agents. His story shifted constantly. Sometimes he claimed the experiment happened exactly as he described, other times he called it a hoax he'd invented to test Jessup's credulity. Yet every time he recanted, he left just enough truth behind to keep the legend alive. The deeper investigators dug, the stranger it became. Some of Allen's details matched classified Navy documents, names, dates, technical jargon, too precise to have been guessed. Others were pure fantasy. He was either an insider turned unstable, or a liar with impossible luck. And then, in 1959, Morris Jessup was found dead in his car. The engine was running. A hose had been connected from the exhaust to the window. It was ruled a suicide. But to those who'd followed his descent, it felt too convenient. In the weeks before his death, he'd told friends he believed he was being followed. He'd spoken of people who don't want this talked about, and of a new set of notes Allen had sent him, ones he never got to publish. Police found no foul play. The case was closed. Yet rumors spread quickly that Jessup had uncovered something real, something worth silencing. Allen resurfaced just long enough to write one last letter, saying he was sorry for what happened. Then, once again, he disappeared. In the years that followed, fragments of declassified documents began to emerge. Some mentioned magnetohydrodynamic research at the Philadelphia Naval Yard. Others referred cryptically to field distortion tests and phase displacement. Most were heavily redacted, entire paragraphs blacked out. But the pattern was unmistakable. Something had been studied, something involving electromagnetic manipulation, and it had been erased from official history. Skeptics called it coincidence. Believers called it proof. Even today, scholars and conspiracists alike argue over the same question. Was the Philadelphia experiment a myth born of madness, or the kind of truth that drives people mad once they glimpse it? And if the story of Allen and Jessup taught us anything, it's this. Sometimes, The loudest lies are built from pieces of quiet truth. Every myth begins with a seed of truth. And when it comes to the Philadelphia experiment, that seed lies in science. Real, documented science, stretched to its breaking point. During the 1940s, physicists were exploring the strange marriage between magnetism, electricity, and gravity. At the heart of this pursuit was Einstein's unfinished masterpiece, the unified field theory. It was an attempt to explain how all forces in the universe could be woven into one seamless equation, a theory that, if mastered, could theoretically allow the manipulation of space-time itself. Most dismissed it as too abstract, too incomplete. But for a military desperate to win a war, even a fragment of that knowledge was enough to try. The U.S. Navy's Research Division, according to fragments of declassified memos, had been working on magnetic field manipulation as early as 1940. Officially, these experiments were about degaussing, neutralizing a ship's magnetic signature so it wouldn't trigger enemy mines. Yet, hidden inside these mundane tests were reports of optical distortions and field anomalies. Scientists observed light bending oddly around energized coils. Compasses malfunctioned, and once, a small test craft vanished from radar for exactly 4 minutes. It returned intact, but the crew swore the sky had changed color. To a physicist, it sounded like nonsense. To a conspiracy theorist, it sounded like a doorway opening. Carl Allen, whose letters sparked the modern legend, had mentioned terms that eerily aligned with real electromagnetic principles. He wrote about rotating magnetic fields and torsion of light vectors. Decades later, researchers found similar concepts in early drafts of radar absorption research. In other words, Allen's wild claims weren't entirely divorced from science, they were tangled with it. Radar invisibility was real, though primitive. By altering the electromagnetic field around an object, it could scatter radar waves, rendering the object difficult to detect. But in theory, if you pushed that same idea to extremes, if the electromagnetic field were powerful enough, it could also distort visible light. The ship wouldn't truly disappear, but to the human eye, it might shimmer, warp, or blur. Now imagine testing that with 1940s equipment, unstable power supplies, untested coils, unshielded magnetic fields. The line between innovation and catastrophe was paper-thin. Some physicists later suggested that if such an experiment occurred, it could have created a temporary electromagnetic bubble, a zone where light, gravity, and time all bent slightly out of sync. Within that bubble, reality might not have behaved as expected. Instruments would fail, perception would twist. For those inside, seconds could stretch into hours, or vanish entirely. It's not hard to see how witnesses could mistake this for teleportation, or something even stranger. One of the most unsettling coincidences emerged in the 1980s. When the Navy confirmed experiments involving electromagnetic hull shielding for radar evasion, tests that used the same principles of field oscillation supposedly described in the Philadelphia experiment. The Navy insisted these were unrelated, but the timing and the terminology were uncanny. Even Einstein's surviving notes, revisited decades later, contained tantalizing hints. He spoke of the interdependence of light and inertia, and theorized that under extreme conditions, space may become curved upon itself locally. If that phrase sounds eerily familiar to descriptions of the Eldridge folding in on itself, it's because the boundaries between science and myth sometimes blur with disturbing ease. Still, none of this proves teleportation. There's no equation in physics that could move a warship hundreds of miles instantaneously. But there are equations that describe how energy fields might distort the way we perceive matter. And if perception is bent far enough, it might look like reality itself is breaking. That's the paradox of the Philadelphia experiment. Every rational explanation leads only partway before plunging into the absurd. Was it magnetism? Was it light distortion? Or was it a catastrophic miscalculation, one that briefly opened a rift between the known and the impossible? Even the skeptics admit one thing: something happened. Too many consistent anomalies. Too many matching accounts from separate witnesses. And then there are the strange details buried in unrelated archives, references to Project Rainbow, a code name that appears in both Navy research logs and, oddly enough, in a set of declassified radar test reports dated 1943, the same year the Eldridge vanished. Perhaps the experiment was never about invisibility at all. Perhaps it was about boundaries, about how far human curiosity could push against the laws of nature before the laws began to push back. Modern physicists, when asked about the Philadelphia experiment, tend to smile politely and call it pseudoscience. But behind closed doors, a few admit it raises interesting hypotheticals. One researcher once wrote, "If space-time is flexible and magnetic fields can affect time dilation even microscopically, then we are closer to the edge of that experiment than anyone realizes." Maybe that's the true terror of the story. Not that it happened once, but that it could happen again. Because science, at its core, is indifferent. It doesn't care whether discovery enlightens or destroys. It only asks to be tested. And in 1943, the US Navy might have tested it just a little too far. The science might have worked, but at what cost? Stories, like ripples, never really end. They only widen. The Philadelphia experiment should have faded into the archives of wartime mythology, a forgotten rumor among the countless secrets of the 1940, but somehow it refused to die. Like the ship itself, it kept reappearing in unexpected places, distorted, fragmented, but never gone. In the decades that followed, whispers of the Eldridge resurfaced again and again, carried by men who claimed to have seen it long after it was officially decommissioned. In 1955, a crew aboard a Norwegian freighter reported encountering a vessel that appeared and disappeared within seconds, its outline eerily similar to a US Navy destroyer escort. They described its hull number as faint but visible, D-173, the number of the Eldridge. When the story reached naval intelligence, it was dismissed as mistaken identity. Yet the witnesses stood by it, their accounts unwavering. In Greece, where the Eldridge had been transferred under the name HS Leon after the war, sailors whispered of strange malfunctions, compasses spinning out of control, equipment failing when the weather was calm, lights flickering on deck when no power was running. A few even claimed that certain nights brought a faint green haze over the ship's bow, like a memory replaying itself through metal. One officer refused to sleep below deck after witnessing a man's silhouette pass through a closed door. Coincidences, maybe. But the pattern was too perfect to ignore. By the 1970s, the story had broken into popular consciousness. It inspired books, late-night radio specials, and eventually the 1984 film The Philadelphia Experiment, which depicted sailors being torn through dimensions and hurled across time. Ironically, the movie didn't bury the legend, it resurrected it. Viewers began writing to television networks, claiming they had known crew members or heard family stories that matched the film's plot in uncanny detail. Some insisted that Hollywood had accidentally told the truth. That's the strange power of myth. Once it enters culture, it starts shaping reality itself. People began finding connections everywhere. In 1969, a classified radar test off Long Island produced unexplained electromagnetic surges, equipment failures that mirrored the descriptions from 1943. In the 1980s, engineers at Montauk Air Force Station conducted psychological field experiments involving high-frequency electromagnetic waves. When word leaked, conspiracy theorists claimed it was a continuation of the Philadelphia experiment under a new name, Project Montauk. The idea was simple but chilling. The experiment had never truly ended. It had evolved. Even now, certain Navy documents reference electromagnetic displacement protocols with dates that trace across decades, from the Cold War to the early stealth IRA. Each mention is subtle, buried in technical jargon. Yet, taken together, they form a trail, a ghostly fingerprint of the same research, rebranded and renamed, moving quietly through history. It's here that the story becomes less about a single ship and more about a pattern. Every few years, reports surface of naval anomalies, radar echoes that appear where no vessel exists, ships vanishing from satellites for minutes, and then returning as if nothing happened. Official explanations always sound reasonable. Weather interference, software glitches, data loss. But the rhythm of these glitches mirrors something older, something first recorded in Philadelphia. Then, there are the human echoes. Descendants of Eldridge crewmen have come forward claiming their relatives were experiment survivors. One woman described her grandfather waking up screaming about the green storm until his death. Another man claimed to possess an old dog tag found fused into a piece of metal. He said it was his father's, and that no tool could separate them. Metallurgists who examined it said the fusion was unexplainable. In modern culture, the story has mutated into countless forms: YouTube documentaries, podcasts, even virtual reality recreations. Yet every version carries the same undertone, the sense that something in 1943 touched a part of reality we still don't understand. And each retelling feels like an echo of a truth we're not supposed to remember. Even within the scientific community, the tale lingers like an itch. Some researchers argue that electromagnetic cloaking, the very concept the Navy was exploring, became the foundation for modern stealth technology. Others dismiss that as myth-making, but it's worth noting that when the US unveiled its first radar-invisible aircraft decades later, the principles sounded eerily familiar: wave refraction, field absorption, minimal surface detection. The same language, refined for a new era. So maybe the Philadelphia experiment wasn't a single moment in history. Maybe it was the beginning of something larger. Door cracked open, never fully shut. A project reborn under new names, new budgets, and new purposes. If you trace the breadcrumbs, Project Rainbow, Project Montauk, and beyond, they form a line, stretching through time like the ghostly wake of a ship that refuses to stay lost. And if that's true, then the Philadelphia experiment didn't just change one vessel. It changed the course of science itself. Because once you've touched the edges of the impossible, you can never go back. You can only keep reaching further, hoping reality doesn't notice what you're doing. Maybe the Eldridge was only the first. Time has a way of swallowing stories, softening their edges until only whispers remain. The USS Eldridge should have been one of them, just another vessel in a war that built thousands. Yet even now, its name surfaces like a ghost ship breaking through fog. Every few years, it drifts back into public consciousness, gliding silently across forums, documentaries, and late-night whispers. You can almost feel it, just below the waves, waiting. Today, the Eldridge rests somewhere far from the shores where it first vanished, decommissioned, dismantled, pieces scattered, repurposed, or lost. But its story, its shadow, still lingers. In the rust of forgotten docks, in the hum of electrical wires during a storm, in the quiet, magnetic stillness of the ocean just before lightning strikes. Some say the ship was scrapped and sold to Greece, reborn as the HS Leon. Others claim that version was a cover story, a shell to hide what truly happened. There are rumors of naval officers visiting the wreck long after it was supposedly retired, taking samples, scraping paint, checking for residual radiation. One diver even claimed the metal vibrated under his palm, as if something deep inside the hull was still alive. Maybe the sea remembers what we try to forget. What fascinates and terrified about the Philadelphia experiment isn't just the science, it's the silence. The way official records trail off exactly where they shouldn't. The way every photograph of the Eldridge feels just slightly wrong, the edges blurred, the lighting unnatural. The Navy never confirmed the experiment, but they never completely denied it either. Their statements were always precise, measured, rehearsed, like an answer written by someone who knows too much. And so the myth endures because it sits in that space between truth and denial, between what can be explained and what refuses to be. It's the same space where every great mystery lives, where logic ends and imagination begins. Think about it. In 1943, human beings may have touched forces beyond comprehension. They might have folded light, bent space, and stepped, if only for a moment, outside of time. And if they did, then maybe the Eldridge isn't gone. Maybe it's still out there, slipping between worlds, a ghost caught in an endless loop of reappearance and erasure. There are sailors who've claimed to hear it, not see it, hear it. A low, humming vibration beneath the surface when the seas are calm, a resonance too mechanical to be natural, too soft to be coincidence. They say radios crackle unexpectedly near the old Philadelphia docks, that signals sometimes spike without explanation, as if the air still holds memory. Others tell stories of seeing distant lights on foggy nights, greenish, pulsing faintly, vanishing when approached. Fishermen call it the ghost current. Scientists call it static interference. But in the dark, when you're alone on the water, explanations don't always feel enough. The truth is, no one ever really wanted to solve the Philadelphia experiment. Not completely. Because what if the answers are worse than the questions? What if someone actually succeeded in breaking reality, and we've been living with the side effects ever since? Look around. Magnetic anomalies, time slips, entire aircraft vanishing from radar for seconds at a time. The excuses are always technical, malfunction, weather, data corruption. But maybe, just maybe, those are the echoes of something humanity set in motion 80 years ago. A ripple still traveling through the fabric of time. And yet, there's something poetic about it too. The idea that one ship, one desperate wartime gamble, might have brushed against the impossible and left a permanent scar on reality. It reminds us that progress and peril are the same thing, two sides of a coin spinning endlessly in the dark. The men aboard the Eldridge are long gone now. Their voices are silent, their records sealed, but every story told in their name gives them a kind of immortality. They've become part of the myth they once lived, half remembered, half believed, and maybe that's all any of us can hope for, to leave behind something that refuses to sink. In the end, the Philadelphia experiment isn't just about physics, or conspiracy, or even war. It's about curiosity, the raw, reckless human need to see beyond the veil. It's about the line between knowledge and madness, and what happens when we step too close to it. If the veil between worlds was ever torn, did it ever truly close? Or are we still peering through that tear, unaware of what's looking back? Sometimes, when you stand by the water and listen to the hum of the sea, you can almost imagine it answering. A low vibration that feels like memory, like a secret older than the ocean itself. Maybe the experiment never ended. Maybe it's still happening, quietly, invisibly, beneath the surface of our understanding. And maybe that's why, after all these years, the sea still hums. They said the Philadelphia experiment was a myth, but myths don't leave classified files behind.